Excellent. Oh, this is so special. I'm so grateful to be here in conversation with you all. Uh, I, as a huge fan of Two Lines Press, of Calico, and everything they do, it just feels really special to be a part of this conversation in a really small way. So thank you to Bookstore Magic. Thank you to Bruna, Johnny, Natalia, Sarah Coolidge, gosh, the whole crew really, Chad, Michael, blah, blah, blah. So thank you very much for being a part of this. And two, it's exciting to talk with translators who, about these gorgeous works. In a sense, I feel that you three are able to hold this multivalent role of reader, too, of fan, of collaborator, of a processor. And I feel like all of us present at the event, me, you all, everybody viewing this, is sort of, in a way, we're all the readers of this work, and we're all kind of able to grapple. Thrilling. So I would love to hear first sort of about your process of coming to the writer's work that you translated, your relationship to the work and the writer themselves. We'll start with maybe Bruna.
Sure. I've been reading Caio since I was a teenager, which I think can, if you like literature a lot, can be common in Brazil because he is taught in some schools, depending on how liberal your school is, and, you know, included in some anthologies. So I found my way to him actually through my parents, which is a very unusual experience because the stories are very homoerotic, but I come from a very strange household where homoeroticism was encouraged. So that's how I came to the book. Yeah, I know. So yeah, my father introduced me to the author. I read his letters and then several of his books, and then later studied him in high school, became obsessed, and then I kind of never saw the book again because I went to boarding school in New Hampshire and then college in Vermont, you know, and it kind of became a thing of my past along with basically everything else about my life. And then at one point I wanted to have a connection to Brazil again and a connection to the language. And I started to unearth the literature, and it was really difficult to get a hold of any books at my school library in Vermont. But I managed to get this anthology by Italo Morricone, and it's in Portuguese, and it's 100 years of the best Brazilian short stories. And I came across Caio again, and that was really wonderful. So it's like, okay, if I do become a translator one day, I feel like I will be able to do this book, partly because it was by reading Caio that I learned how to translate. It was by studying his work also that I became a writer, and that I got a pretty good sense of how to play with cadence and melody and syntax and how to write a long sentence and a short sentence and for what effect. So there was a personal baggage too, you know, the fact that people around me cared about the books. But there was also the fact that I found the book at such a formative time in my life, I think.
Johnny?
Should I speak?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So I guess I have a very different path to the poetry that I translated by Márcio Junqueira. In fact, I know some of the other writers much better, like that Bruna mentioned. You know, Caio Fernando Abreu is really well known, especially for his short stories. And if I'm not mistaken, two of the writers that are probably some of the more famous writers, João Gilberto Noll as well, both hail from Rio Grande do Sul, which is where I think I'm right. I think I'm correct about that. But that's where my family's from. But then, of course, the writer that I translated has no connection to Rio Grande do Sul. I found a poet from Bahia, Márcio, to translate, and I just want to say that sort of my, I guess, the way I found the poetry was that I was asking people that I knew, writers in Rio Grande do Sul, for suggestions for people that maybe need to have more of an opportunity to be in the spotlight. Maybe some of the lesser known or the sort of the lights that are not yet shining as brightly on the literary scene, just because they need more opportunity. And so I was excited to find a poet that I think hopefully more Brazilians will find out about, but also obviously now that it's in English, maybe more Americans and English speaking readers will find out about. And I have to say too that some of my work now as a translator has been informed by the Black Lives Matter movement. So I just wanted to say that I think for a lot of us who have experienced these last few years of turmoil across the country, I thought to myself, how might that affect my work as a translator? And so when there's an opportunity to bring, if in some small way I can bring any more attention to the work of people who self-identify as people of color or as Afro-Brazilian or as Black, that I would try to be very intentional about that. So so that's my story. So pass the mic to Natalia.
Hi everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you, fellow panelists and Sarah. So I guess I was gifted one of Tatiana's poetry books, Lundu, maybe in 2017, and I fell in love with Tatiana's work, with her care, with words and structure, and as she calls herself a palavreira, like a worder, a wordsmith, and that comes across in her poetry. And I've always loved languages, and English was kind of my refuge when I was younger. I thought like not many people spoke English, so I would write secret letters. I had like this weird relationship with the language. And then Tatiana's words also have this healing power. And when I started experimenting with translating her work, I was faced with so much depth, and I had to do so much, spend a long time reflecting and considering and researching and seeing how she uses different languages, like beyond, let's say, standard Portuguese. She uses Portuguese, which is like Black Portuguese, queerness. She uses Spanish. She will use whatever she needs and creates and bring to the page so much meaning. So I guess that's kind of how my relationship with her work started. And ever since I've been able, she has been to Sapatão e Ficção, which is the panel I used to host in Rio de Janeiro. And we have a very, very lovingly like relationship, and we have very good exchanges about this, all of this process of translation. Tatiana herself is a translator. She mostly translates from English into Portuguese, and I believe into Brazilian Portuguese, and I believe that her work has to be everywhere. And I think bringing it into English-ish is a way of making that movement. And what we see a lot here in the United States is people referring to Brazilian literature as objects, but not considering Brazilian thought, not considering Brazilian aesthetics. So this is like one of the motivations behind I have behind translating this work. That's it.
It's really marvelous. I'm really eager to get into later in this conversation, thinking about the multiple languages that are being translated within these pieces. Thinking about Brazilian literature as object, or sort of national literatures as a whole, as a child of an immigrant myself, and as people who all have complicated and extensive relationships with multiple home countries. How do you think about the role of, creating a national identity through literature, but particularly a queer one? So to present queer writing from Brazil as the sort of Brazilian queerness. I am so curious to hear your thoughts about this, sort of the inclusion in the anthology question, really.
Should we follow the same order?
Sure, that would be great. It's how
I
you are all
offer
on
myself,
my screen.
yeah, I offer myself as a tribute. This,
Sorry,
I am
Bruna.
stunned by this question. I do not, I will not pretend I have an answer. So I think I am of two minds about this. One is that I resist the anthologizing impulse and the representative impulse altogether. I don't think that there is anything we could possibly do that's going to be a representative window of anything, because there are other forces at play, right? It's so arbitrary. There is the fact that these are the authors we happen to be translating now, that maybe 5 years ago or 5 years from now, this would be a different anthology. And I think we're also very limited in our understanding of a country, of Brazil. I am from the northeast of Brazil. I won't pretend I know the first thing about Rio's aesthetic, because I don't, and I think vice versa. So as most countries are, Brazil is a very divided one. It has lots of internal boundaries and borders there. I only know my own corner, and the little corners I've spent a significant time in and that I've studied, at length. And I happen to know a little bit of the queer corner of the Brazilian Northeast, and that's kind of as far as my expertise goes. Like, I don't claim to be an authority in anything else. I will say one thing, then it's the other mind. On the other hand, I have noticed patterns in my experience of this, right? So within that limited frame I've had the chance to experience patterns there. One thing is, obviously, exile is a big theme in Brazilian literature that I've worked with, partly because of colonialism and also partly because of political instability. We're always existing vis-a-vis Europe or vis-a-vis the United States and looking toward the outside and comparing. And in my translations of Abreu, I'm always talking about old movies and Audrey Hepburn and the Beatles and old rock songs and Satie and lots of sentences in French and Sontag and Beauvoir. And, so there is, I think, this very cosmopolitan or multilingual relationship to other Latin American countries and to our colonizers and new colonizers. That's one pattern I've noticed. And then the other thing, I think, is there is a sense of hopelessness in a lot of the literature I've worked with, but it's full of celebration. It's a way to, at least in Caio, to celebrate the decay, the despair, to put some glitter on the wound kind of thing. And I'm really drawn to that. I've worked with a couple of writers who do this kind of thing. I think it's my kind of aesthetic. I love a good sparkly tragedy. Yeah, but I don't know how that would work at all with the more contemporary writers from, different time periods with different concerns. But it's been lovely to see that with the authors from the 80s I've worked with.
I'll just keep the order going then. Yeah, I mean, these are tricky questions, and I also don't pretend, like Bruna, I don't pretend to sort of like have really a sort of a position on some of this. But I mean, I will say, okay, so as me myself, I'm not queer identified. I find myself translating the poetry and thinking about an anthology like this, and thinking about it in the terms of someone who, like, I was an English major. I'm an English professor. I have to say that this is me betraying my age here, because I'm very close to 50, and maybe this is something that only people who are in my age group might recognize. But I was not introduced to any poets who were queer identified when I was in high school, certainly not in Catholic school. Sorry, I don't know why that's funny to me, but certainly not till, not even really through college. And the truth is I was reading queer poetry. It just wasn't taught that way. I mean, certainly Whitman was never taught to me as having any kind of queer aesthetic. And I have to say that I think that for, you know, maybe the community that reads poetry, the community of people that write poetry, and especially for, I would say, young queer students, for example, it does mean, right? It does mean something to have access to, let's say, an anthology like this, that maybe, this is sort of like, I guess in a way, this is like the positive spin on all this, is that I don't think it seems so exceptional to have these sorts of like queer writing, how do I say this, like sort of mentor figures, or to kind of understand who your sort of queer ancestry is. You know, like when I was like thinking about these questions about queerness and poetry, a lot of it was sort of reading against the grain, like of my education. And I think that like with my students at Montclair State, it's a whole other reality that I didn't have available to me. Thinking about even names now that, you know, James Baldwin, I mean, James Baldwin was never presented to me as a queer writer. He's presented to me as a civil rights activist. And Whitman was, you know, basically like the father of American poetry, you know, but without any of those like obviously homoerotic scenes of the bathers and the secretive towels left beside his, you know, sleeping body, like all this language. So I see this work also in that context of an anthology that's so just sort of brazenly out and queer identified and unapologetic, as you can tell even from the cover of the anthology. And I would say, to kind of go back to what Bruna was saying about translating Caio Fernando Abreu, when you have all these allusions to American culture and to like European, you know, I have to say that that's something that I think it's good for Americans to think about when they're reading. Like my poet too, there's two allusions to Elizabeth Bishop. There's an allusion to Bob Dylan. And I think that, you know, it can be surprising when Americans realize that Brazilians know so well American music and American literature, and they read American literature in translation, or they try to read it in the original English. And as we know, I think American readers sometimes need to be almost pushed to international work and translation, forcibly made to open some of these works. So anyway, so that's what I'll say about that. So thank you for your patience. Oh, Natalia.
So I won't repeat anything that Bruna or Johnny have said. I would say, yeah, I would hate for somebody to get this book and say, this is what Brazilian queerness is, period. And I think that was never the goal of anybody involved in this project. As Bruna has said, Brazil is huge, not only in like literal geographical terms, but also in cosmological stances and spiritual manifestations. And I think it is interesting for us to think through how United Statian culture has infiltrated Brazil, has permeated somewhat of what queerness has been about, but not entirely and not always. And we have other spaces of queerness or sexual dissidence or gender dissidence that is not, they are not informed by United Statian, global North aesthetics, ethics, identities. So I think we'd have to think about that too. It's interesting because when I'm translating Tatiana's work, for example, I'm not thinking of a United Statian audience. I'm thinking of people who are reading in English. And that could mean like a lot of people, a number of people. And because of that too, like I'm not, so Tatiana is Afro-Brazilian I'm gonna translate into African American English. That's not what I'm gonna do here. So I think there's that too. That's the complication of colonial legacies, right? And neo-colonial, neo-imperialist legacies. So I guess that's the best answer I can give right now. What is Brazilian queerness is so much. And even, again, I use the term sexual dissidents. There are people who deny entirely the idea of even queer with a C-U-I-R, as we have spelled it here. Some find it a more interesting space to exist in or to create within. But in terms of Brazil, there's that debate. Is it a failed nation state or is it a successful nation state? Because on the basis of on which it was created, it's successful, and its success is necessarily violent. So, for instance, like indigenous non-normativity is a part of that territory that now we name Pindorama, that we call Brazil, but doesn't necessarily want to belong to this nation state idea. So these are all very complicated, layered things for us to think through.
Can I add one more thing, Sarah? I'm so happy with everyone's responses. I was smiling. Though this is all very serious, I was smiling out of recognition and understanding and joy. The one thing I wanted to say is that the concept of queerness is both anachronistic and a cultural imposition. So, but that being said, I think we lack, a term. It's kind of beyond language. So I've been thinking a lot about that. Obviously, I don't have a better word, but for one, Caio didn't identify as neither queer nor gay. If I were to impose a label on him, it would be something like pansexual, but he didn't identify as that either. He was just very happy to love who he loved at the time, and that would change, And I think, it's important, as we all know, to think about queerness as something that is not so easily translated, and that it shouldn't always be translated. It's also okay that there isn't a word.
Absolutely right, and I think this is also interesting. I love that about this anthology, is that it's not trying to prescribe a sort of identity on anybody, and it's not starting with bios or starting with this person identified as this, now here's their story. This isn't, it's starting with the language of the writer themselves and the translator as well, of course. I absolutely love it. I mean, I think this is a habit of the Calico series thus far, is these sort of intrusions, these sort of small kind of creative thoughts, these tiny ideas that are grouped together, not to form a prescription or a single ideology, but to just kind of broaden one's mind a little bit and think a little bit more about what are the multiple things that this title could mean, or that these people could be trying to say. I have too many questions for you all. That's what I'll say. I emailed questions earlier today, and then I added more, and now I need to kind of pull back a little bit. And I do want to get to these questions about sort of working from, yes, thank you to Sarah Coolidge. Seriously, I mean, this is such a thoughtfully examined, project. The idea of working with multiple languages or dialects beyond just like this and that, the sort of process of translation from Portuguese, from dialects, but also from queer Portuguese and from queer period into another queer language of English. I'm thinking about too Natalia and Johnny, where I see your creative translations of words that are smushed together, drawn out, separated by parentheses. I love it. How did you approach this sort of, all three of you really, but I would love to start with Natalia. How did you approach sort of translating one person's individual language that she's created into English? That's a question.
So it has been a labor of love. And as I said before, form is really important for Tatiana. You will see that like her published poems are like Queer Paradise number 39. It's the 39th version. And she keeps working on it and working on it, working. And that's the work of translating her work as well. It's never done. It's published here. Maybe in a couple of years, I'll have a different iteration. I'll see different things. And what I was trying to do was to, when possible, respect the original form of what she was going for. Or for instance, talhos, gashes, ends with like an alliteration. And I was like, I need this alliteration in the English one as well. So I'm gonna make, I won't sleep until that happens. So it was like just really this passion for respecting, trying to do justice to Tatiana's work, but also respecting her craft. And in a sense, mine as well, because this is the kind of language and work I want to put out in the world. And I guess I would say one last thing is that what many people have said, Eduardo Lisson has said this many years ago, but a number of Brazilian sexual dissident people say that we have right to opacity. We have to be entitled to a right of opacity. Not everything has to be reviewed, not everything has to be literal, not everything has to be given or explained. So I was thinking about that as well as I work through my translations.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
I just wish that Bruna and Natalia weren't so just beautifully articulate on the spot. It kind of puts a lot of pressure on me. So I'll begin with like the small things that I think that you're hinting at, Sarah, with your question. Like in Marcio's poem, a couple of things that I think you notice about the way it looks on the page. I think it's very similar to some of the ways in which Natalia's work, maybe she's also thinking about like even the way the words seem to be manifesting themselves on the page. You can tell that there's a kind of a playfulness happening with the language, a kind of work to sort of destabilize what the language is doing. I think in that sense, that's also how we're thinking about queer. We're thinking about the queering of the language. Because if queerness in some way is a way of kind of imagining something beyond the language we've been given, then poetry is also that search, right? Poetry is also that search to imagine a new language. So you find in Sábado, in the Saturday, the poem that I translated, you find a game with parentheses, because I think parentheses also play that game of like concealing, but not really. You notice that there's a lot of blank space in the poem. And I think for those of us who love poetry, this happened actually in some of the Clarice Lispector that I translated, where she's obsessed with silence. She's obsessed with, in one of the books I translated, there's a page she left blank out of frustration. I think a lot of us approach silence as really where the meanings happen. And so I think what Natalia referred to as that sort of right to obscurity is also what I'm speaking to as well. One of the things that my students in the classroom, sorry to keep bringing you back to teaching, but I just taught today. So my students of poetry often admit it's the thing that intimidates them about poetry, is precisely this. It's the ambiguity, as though that were something that needed to be fixed, that needed to be resolved. And to kind of get back to Natalia's point, I think I'm doing good work if I tell them please to put that anxiety somewhere else, because we're not reading poetry the way I think poetry is inviting us to read it. If we're constantly trying to think that the words that we have are going to explain the very fundamental mystery of being, of having a body, of existing in time, these are not things that our words are ever going to bring us closer to fully understanding.
So interesting. I mean, I think this gets at a lot of what I was kind of trying to ask you all about this, about sort of these multiple languages, about kind of attempting to parse the meaning from experience and put it into words. What the heck? And then also to think about the sense of the interior and confidentiality. Thinking about Fat Tuesday, there's a very beautiful moment in the story where the narrator says, like, oh, I'm not going to read from the book, it's right here next to me. Effectively, like, I saw nobody else, but I saw this other person. He didn't, even, it wasn't about him being queer effectively, but he was just a body that happened to be masculine, and mine was a body that happened to be masculine. And it's this moment of absolute epiphany across the dance floor. Bruna, can you talk a little bit about the sort of sense of secretiveness, confidentiality in this piece?
Yeah, the story, all of Caio's stories, sorry, we're on a first name basis, so I call him Caio. People think it's Kyle, that's Caio Fernando Abreu. So Caio's work feels very intimate. All of it is like dim lighting, or, there is that sense of someone whispering the story in your ear that I love about it. And then I think in some of the stories, that could be because it's unsafe to be out, right? As we see in that one. So there is that secrecy, there is the actual whispering happening around the party, or people communicating in the quietest of ways so that they won't get, quote unquote, caught. And then in some other stories, that is going to be someone being really lonely because of the kinds of isolations that they have to go through, this imposed, this form of exile within their own country, that they're craving intimacy and company so bad that there is that thirst to be like, please stand very close to me, talk really close to me. I want you to spit in my face when you talk, like that close. Yeah, and I get that sense from all of the stories. It's a desperation for company, a desperation for love. And I also don't identify as queer. I should put that disclaimer like Johnny did. So one way for me to access this in the stories was through my experiences of foreignness. Not for the same reasons, I understand not being able to speak too loudly because you're afraid you might get hurt. I understand not being able to show my body in certain places. So I had to do an exercise and transposing my experience, with this other experience. And then also, I remember growing up and going out with my relatives who were only out in certain neighborhoods or in certain houses, and it's a strange kind of pain. The sentences have this wounded quality to them that I find really moving. I don't know that I can quite put into words, in the sense that the description doesn't match the experience of reading it, right? It takes that number of pages to develop this. I'm not gonna summarize it in like 2 sentences. But that sense of the wound getting, or sometimes it's more like a primal scream kind of scene, the fact that this really adds up. The feeling of secrecy, the feeling of intimacy, it does kind of have to burst. It has to go somewhere. And I think we see that in the story when both they have a sexual climax and they also have a violent climax that comes from their attackers in the story.
Absolutely. And I can't help but think about, kind of interior and confidentiality without thinking of the sexual as well. I mean, I'm thinking about the language that you're using and how it kind of relates in all ways to these experiences, this primal scream. And I think too about Natalia, your translation of Tatiana's poetry, thinking to me a queer paradise could be a very simple place, laying my head betwixt your tits. And it's this sort of multiple experiences of secrecy by force, by necessity, and also by pleasure and desire, which is absolutely beautiful. I'm going to do really, let's see, I'm wondering if I should start getting to the Q&A here. Folks, please feel free to ask in the Q&A feature if you have any questions. I think I'm going to transition over to that as it is 8:15 Eastern time. And then no one has questions. I may go back to my own if you guys are okay with that. Let's see here. So first of all, from Fernanda, we have a question for Natalia. I don't know if I'm crossing a line here, and I'm sorry if I am, but can you share Tatiana's feedback on being translated and on your translations?
Well, she likes them. And she has said, like in other meetings we've had, that she thinks I'm a good translator because I'm also a good poet. And I think that's an interesting notion. A number of translators share this, authors and translators share this notion that usually people who are good poetry translators are good poets themselves. I'm not sure I am. I can be very cheesy writing my own poetry. I'm not ashamed of that. But yeah, I think that's the short answer. We worked through some of the poetries together. I have translated a lot more of Tatiana's work. This is just a very small sample, and she's been very generous and kind in this collaborative work.
That's fantastic. And I think too about her relationship to building a set of ideas by sort of a manifesto in a way through poetry, the idea of like the queerness of African diaspora and the sort of proliferation. Really interesting. Let's see, we have one other question here. Would love to hear the panelists talk about the visual story or the aesthetic element of storytelling / world building being created in and by this book.
I don't know about the book as a whole, but at least for, I know Ed, is Ed still here? Ed Moreno, yeah, he's still here, who translated the other one of Caio's pieces. Hello, a nonfiction piece, and I translated a short story. Sorry, the cat is meowing intensely, so don't mind that. Yeah, so it's, on the one hand, you know, we have more than one take even on the same author, let alone the multiplicity of perspectives here is the whole point. So, but visually, I think of unsanitized and willing to mingle and mix languages and images, and, you know, like that beautiful sense of contamination. Yeah, is what I think of when I'm thinking of this work.
Mm-hmm. Natalia, do you have something like interesting to say? Because I can't formulate any good response as good as Bruna's. So
yeah, Bruna did amazing. In fact, I'm 2/3 in the book. I think there are authors I didn't know myself. There are authors, so many authors who are not here. And of course, it's one anthology. It's not like the, I don't know. And again, it doesn't intend to be like a comprehensive, the ultimate queer history of Brazil or anything like that. But actually, if you allow me, I would like to read a short poem by Tatiana. Okay, so we're gonna have Brazilian, Portuguese first, and then English very quickly, okay?
Mhm.
Palhos. It's page 174 if you have the book there in front of you. 174. Palhos. Aprender a tempestade, soltar o seu peso, secar ao sol, rugir trovões. Derramar a tempestade, despir de peso, pairar no sol, cantar trovões. Suceder a tempestade, fluir seu peso, beijar o sol, gozar trovões. Antecipar a tempestade, ruir seu peso, lunar o sol, cuíer trovões. E para que nada te desfaça, se refaça, se refaça, se refaca. So gaseous. Learn the tempest, let her weight go, dry in the sun, roar thunders. Flood the tempest, undress her load, hover in the sun, sing thunders. Succeed the tempest, flow her burden, kiss the sun, come thunders. Anticipate the tempest, collapse her gravity, moon the sun, queer thunders. And nothing shall unmake you, react you, react you, reacts. So I think this short little poem kind of, and in a way answers the next question, sorry. I saw one of the questions there, which is difficult translation choices and aesthetic choices. Sometimes they're challenging but never difficult, because doing this work is very pleasurable to me, has been very pleasurable to me. But things like lunar o sol, I could do like a long-winded explanation on what different imageries there could be in English, but I think that moon the sun is just delicious. And it has the aspect of the moon there. The final, as I mentioned before, the final alliteration here in this poem, from knife we went to an axe, but it's still a cutting object, and it's there. So I think these sort of choices make the translation work. And again, I saw Two Lines Press talking about why they're called Two Lines Press, right? Because it's the author and the translator. And I guess this is what this work is. Like the querying of this colonial vice of having one author, one brilliant mind, one of each, and that's it, because it's and I have trouble with this word, is a system of scarcity, right? Scarcity. So I guess that's it for me.
Yeah.
Lovely.
It's so beautiful to have the face-to-face Portuguese and English. It really is. I mean, I'm not sure if people know this outside of you know, the world of translation, but it's not typical. It's not typical to find presses, publishers that are willing to devote that much space and ultimately money to have both languages represented, because obviously the easier solution would be just to have it in English, right? And it really takes a certain amount of stubbornness, I think, to say we want to see the languages side by side. And I think that there's so many reasons why I think that's important, and part of it is just be able to appreciate what Natalia was just talking about seeing the poetry side by side. But I also think that, you know, I have bilingual books where there are languages that I don't speak, and I still, you know, I don't know if it's a kind of like fetishistic pleasure, but I think it's also just an intellectual curiosity about seeing what it looks like in the other language, and if you can decipher anything there. And I think that kind of open-heartedness to languages, plural, and also to not, I guess I'll bring it back to teaching. A lot of my students don't want to go on a student exchange because they're afraid of going somewhere where they don't speak the language. And it seems to me like someone put it in their heads that they should feel afraid of that kind of, you know, that shock of not understanding. And I think poetry is pretty good about that, right? About teaching us that not understanding does not mean it's not meaningful. And I think anything that we can do to have people be a little bit less uptight when they're not understanding the language, I think already is good work. You go to that country precisely because you don't speak the language, right? And then you begin to speak the language, whether you want to or not. You're going to eventually start speaking the language. I think that commitment to languages is one more beautiful aspect of the book.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, truly. And with poetry and with prose, to have both side by side. I think this does tie into the question which, Natalia, you were referencing. Alex Tan asks, I wonder if you all could say a bit about a difficult decision you had to make in the translation, maybe with a certain formal feature, something to do with the formatting of a poem, the rhythm of a sentence or paragraph, or translating from dialect. What were some possible choices you grappled with, and why did you choose one over another?
I can continue following the order. There was quite a few words in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese, that come from Yoruba in Caio's work. And, you know, that could be Iemanjá, like the deity from the Afro-Brazilian religion that also appears in other Afro-Latin American religions. All kinds of little phrases. And at the party, apologies, the cat. It's because she can hear my voice and thinks I'm talking to her. Yeah, so at the party that the story is set at this party, it's a carnival party, Fat Tuesday, and they're wearing a costume. And even the costume alone, if you don't know the religions, it's impossible to know what they are dressed as. He's wearing a loincloth, and then there are many words that are pretty much untranslatable. So the difficulty for me there was because it's at the beginning of the story, we're being introduced to these characters. The challenge was to not lose the flow of the story while also having words that are very obscure, right? So I had to do a little bit of that. So what I did to balance that out was I did keep everything in the original, those words that did not wish to be rendered clear. I kept them as they were. But then if there was a sentence really short, something like they were dancing, I might say they were dancing in the middle of the room, just adding a little bit of cushion. I sometimes think of it as adding a little bit of porch to the house, just so that we have time to breathe. And then when you have quite a few foreign words, they're really not daunting. It's part of this flow that I was creating. And I think the music is kind of what moves you forward. And there is that music already in the original. I wasn't making it up, you know, but I was conscious of that as a way to allow myself to be unclear or mysterious or the story wanted me to be.
Yeah. Thinking too about how many references there are to American or British individuals in these stories. It's kind of like, how are we kind of tempering our relationship with the reader who is English speaking too? And Johnny, in your translation, I saw this one line where you left the original and then followed up with a English translation, and it put so much emphasis on the wordplay and the totally sumptuous language. I am thinking of that line, not to put an answer in your mouth, but just to add.
Yeah. I don't think I have, I think Natalia would have a more probably interesting answer than me about sort of the way you have to be creative with some of the diction to try to capture what the original language is doing than in my case. But I would say that one of the things that does happen, there's a moment, for example, where he says, the speaker of the poem says something like, segunda-feira é o melhor dia de começar a acabar. It's like, and he made that one word, começa a acabar, it's like, so it's really two words, to begin and to end. And sometimes in English, you're just lucky because there's something you can do that works. And then other times you're not so lucky. And I think, Bruna, I think in some way was talking about this as well, that you have to find a way as a translator maybe to kind of, sometimes you have to be faithful to the spirit of the sentence or the line, even if you're not particularly faithful to the precise words. In English, I was able to say, instead of begin or end, I made a neologism with beg end, which I liked too because it had the word beg in it, which isn't in the original, but I just liked the fact that this had something to do with young love and that sort of desperation that we often feel. There's also the issue of the blank page. There's so much empty space in between some of these lines, but it does create a kind of a sense of time in the original. And I just have to say, working with Sarah Coolidge, that was never really an issue for anyone. Like, no one gave me a hard time about some of the wasted space, because I think there was an understanding that a work of art has its time as well, produces its own time in a sense. And so I think that was something that I was ready to sort of fight for, but it never actually materialized as a fight. So it's just like, damn you, you're so cool.
So cool.
Everyone's so cool already. I have nothing to fight for. Thank you. I just want to say one thing that I wanted to make a connection with what Bruna was talking about with Fat Tuesday, is that because I made a connection before with Natalia, but in my translation of Sábado, I noticed there is also fear, and that it's not as violently expressed as I know what happens at the end of that story, but there's fear, and you sense it in more subtle ways. And there's always fear, I think, when young people are developing crushes on each other. There's fear of embarrassment, fear of humiliation. You're also thinking about the fear of possibly outing yourself in a situation that might be uncomfortable or dangerous to you afterwards. And in the background of the poem, there are these boys who are described as lobos bobos, like the sort of, it must be a direct reference to the João Gilberto song. There's a song that goes lobo bobo. But you get the sense that there's the possibility of like savage violence always kind of in the background. And so it was interesting to me that that's there, but it's also in a paradoxical way, it can also be a form of pleasure, because knowing that you're doing something dangerous is also a kind of pleasure. Not to justify anything, but I think we understand the ways in which the imagination can turn suffering into a kind of joy.
Yeah. And to think about, really quickly, to think about the sort of space that is afforded to silence and to the passage of time too, just to share with readers who have already ordered their book but haven't gotten it yet, hint, hint, or are about to buy it tomorrow morning, first thing, this sort of beautiful, dual, negative space. I have this big note as somebody who adores sci-fi, and particularly sci-fi that has to do with queer identities and actions. I just have this big note in my kind of questions tab that just says, think about the passage of time, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Yeah. Not anything very cogent, as nearly as cogent as anything y'all have said tonight, but just something that rings so beautiful in all of your pieces. Natalia, I wanted to give you a chance to talk through this kind of difficult decisions in translation, if you wanted to speak more about that.
I think with the reading of the poem and what I added later on, I think I've kind of answered this question.
Awesome.
I would say that when people do get the book, send me an email. Like, let's keep the conversation going. Let's share each other's impressions, because I think I would add that English doesn't own me, and I don't owe anything to English. The language is there, and I'll bend it, I'll shift it, I'll create new words. I don't need permission to do so. I've been teaching this language for over 10 years. And honestly, I think it's wonderful not to feel this obligation again to make everything known. That is not my job. So English is just another language, and here we are, and here are we are communicating in English. It's allowing us to communicate. But yeah, that's it. I don't think um, I did anything to make the poetry fit into English, if that makes sense. Like I hope I didn't do anything that disrespected the original, and also my ethical stance as a translator.
Yeah, wonderful. Just one last comment, not a question, just a thank you. It is important to have queer Brazilian authors translated. I agree with this commenter. It is important to have you all here in conversation too, and thinking about how we continue to work around and read and love and hate these words. And so I'm really grateful that the three of you could be here tonight. Thank you so much to Bruna, to Johnny, to Natalia, Serena, thank you. Everybody watching, thank you so much. And Sarah Coolidge and Michael Holtman and Chad Felix, who I've communicated with about this event, and many others, and many more of your wonderful books. That was a lot of thank yous from me. I'm going to pass it back to Serena, but much appreciated to everybody tonight.